we talked a lot this morning about the rules and a little bit less about the exceptions, so I was grateful when David Weller talked about the exceptions, and I think you called them a presumption in favor of cross-border data flows and avoidance of data localization. And I guess implied there is that the exception built into those obligations is quite broad for legitimate policy reasons. And I'm just wondering what you think is the right agenda going forward. Should we aim for more precision about what those exceptions look like in future agreements, rely on things that are traditional? Maybe we need to create new things in this space? Or is this about what we can do in a trade context? And to go further, we need to use other channels to, explain to countries that if their priority is privacy, or if it's law enforcement, or whatever it is, it's not best achieved through measures that would violate these rules. So just curious, any of your comments on that?
Michael, could you just introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, Michael Smart, Rockby Global Advisors.
So I think I have two thoughts on that. The first thought is actually stepping back, and I should have actually talked about this a little bit earlier. One of the things to keep in mind when you're talking about exceptions is that the exceptions only even become relevant if there's a challenge. And there's not a WTO or an FTA police force that goes around and arrests countries for breaking the rules. Countries do what they think they're allowed to do within the scope of the rules that they've agreed to. And it's really only when they do something objectionable that really causes trade issues that you even see the issue of a dispute rising and these exceptions even entering into the equation. So to me, again, I'll bring it back just very briefly to the localization issue. It's interesting that U.S. regulators and regulators around the world, they regulate quite a bit in these industries, but you don't see trade cases in these industries because by and large, and especially in the case of the U.S., they regulate legitimately. And they're addressing legitimate issues, and their counterparts in other countries agree because they have the same task, and so you're not going to see cases. And so you're not going to even reach the issue of the exceptions. But then to go to your specific question, I would say my view is that sure, everything can always be improved, but there's some real merit in having relatively broad exceptions that aren't too prescriptive because they then are better able to adapt to changes in the way that the world works. And this sector obviously is one of the best examples. If you go back and try to look at the GATS classifications of services and you try to figure out whether a service is a telecom service or a computer service or a financial service, you can just turn yourself into knots. And so that's one of the virtues of the negative list. As Jackie said, it sweeps all that away, and the bias is just in favor of liberalization. And so to me, having that general kind of flexibility with a necessity test and just to protect things has worked out pretty well so far.
The only thing I'd add to it, basically agree with what David said, is what are the right tools and vehicles? So ultimately in the area of transfer of information and data, right? One of the sticking points, there are others, but one of the sticking points is privacy, right? And data protection regulation. And so the question is, if you have an exception that allows for governments to restrict the movement of data in certain circumstances, but then you're going to kind of build vehicles that allow for interoperability, things like the APEC cross-border privacy rules or the US-EU privacy shield. Those are ultimately items of substance and expertise that kind of extend pretty far outside of trade. And I think a lot of people in the privacy community understandably are concerned, do you want trade negotiators sitting here and negotiating in a pretty prescriptive way about what kinds of interoperability mechanisms are acceptable or not. So I think there's a real issue of complementarity that you have to think about. Of you have a broad framework of exceptions that we've lived with under the GATT for 70 years. They've worked pretty well in terms of distinguishing what is discrimination, what is market access barrier from legitimate regulation. But then you have other complementary tools where some of those kind of regulatory standards for interoperability are worked out kind of alongside. And ultimately, you need both for it all to work.